Mm. Sorry. Well, hello, everyone. It's your girl, Gabrielle. Welcome to a brand new episode of Hot Topics. Let me tell you what this show is about in case you are new to the show or maybe you've been to the show and you forgot. So let me just remind you. So, Hot Topics is the show where we like to have real talk about real things. We like to talk about things in education, employment, mental health, physical health. We've done episodes about homeschooling, living with disabilities, artificial intelligence, self care, what else? Talking with tutors. So we've covered a variety of different grounds, but all with the one purpose of teaching you something, of learning you something for you to be 1% better than how you were yesterday. So that is the point of Hot Topics. And today is no different. So today is actually going to be a continuation of a theme that I've been doing. And that theme is study abroad. So this is actually the sixth installment of the study abroad theme. I'm bringing it back for the sixth time. So I love it when I bring back topics. And let me tell you my guest who's going to help me with this discussion. His name is Sameer Dossani, and let me tell you about him. I'm going to give you a brief synopsis about him. So, Sameer Dossani is a health and nutrition coach specializing in helping people reverse chronic disease and achieve optimal health and wellness. Fabulous. Fabulous, fabulous. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Sameer to the stage. Hi, Sameer. How you doing today?
Doing well, Gabrielle. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you for coming on Hot Topics, and thank you for helping me continue my study abroad theme that I've been having. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's jump right into it. So you have an amazing story, an amazing journey, and I'd love for you to share it with our audience. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass the baton. So tell us about your study abroad experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm born and raised in the U.S., but I've been to university 3 times. I have degrees in sort of I haven't finished the latest one, but I have degrees in things like philosophy, religious studies, women's studies, and just finishing a PhD in anthropology. And I've studied in 3 different countries. So the first degree was in Canada at McGill University in Montreal. So that was, people think Canada is a lot like the US, and to an extent it is. But where I was and when I was there, it wasn't at all like the US. It was very different. Of course, Montreal is the biggest city in Quebec, which is the francophone region of Canada. And then, yeah, so then I went on to do my master's in Australia. Um, completely different side of the world, completely different experience. Learning how to get along there wasn't always easy, but it was fun. And now I am just about to complete a PhD in South Africa. This is at a different point. So those two things were sort of very early in my life, early in my career. I started undergrad when I was 18, as most people do. I did my master's at the age of about 25. No, sorry, 24. Now I'm in my 40s, and going back to school in South Africa has been really interesting too.
So you've definitely bounced around from country to country. So, one of the things that I picked up was every stage of your academic career is in a completely different country, right? So you did your undergrad in Canada, you did masters in
Australia.
Australia, yes, excuse me, and then now PhD in South Africa. So where are you right now as you're doing this interview?
You are talking to me when I'm on holiday visiting my folks in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, not too far away from where you are, I think. But I'll be back in South Africa in September.
I'm sorry, you completed your PhD or you're still doing it?
No, I have a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on which of my advisors you ask, to submit a draft of the thesis. But I'm hoping to finish it in the next year or so.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. All
Mhm.
right, so let's go to the beginning. All right, so how on earth did you end up in Canada?
I had some choices. So I applied like most people do. At least when I was graduating high school in the '90s. I think nowadays young people have a lot more of a plan. Or at least many of them do. But I wasn't a young person with a plan. I just applied to wherever I thought might be interesting, including a couple of places abroad. So McGill was the main one where I ended up. I think I also applied to the University of Toronto, maybe something in England too. My memory's not that great about this. But my second choice, I ended up in McGill, as I said, in Montreal. If I hadn't gone there, I would probably have gone to Columbia in New York City. And at that time, Columbia tuition is not what it is today, but at least it was 25 to 30,000 a year. So 30,000 a year times four, 120,000. I would have had to get student loans. I would have started my life with, depending on how much my parents could lend me, I mean, between 80 and 120,000 in debt, right? And to me, that was just limits your options. And especially looking back at the career I had, I'm not sure I would have made the same choices if that I did make if I had, a huge amount of student debt. It would have been much more difficult for me to do the kind of things that I did, which I was able to not prioritize sort of pay and income and salary and so on, and to prioritize life experiences and contribution to society, the things that I wanted to do in that career.
And what did you study in
So
Canada?
yeah, yeah. So I had a B. So I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts with honors in philosophy and religious studies. And what I really got into, sort of towards the end, I think for the first couple of years I was just a little lost. I didn't really have a focus. But in the last couple of years, what I really got into was this idea that a lot of the ideas that are in Mahayana Buddhism, so that's a specific kind of Buddhism, are really similar to some of the ideas in Greek philosophy. So I started writing these sort of comparative papers between Greek philosophy and Japanese Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism. It was really interesting, and it was really fun. And it's one of those things where I think for me the point of an undergraduate degree, especially now that I sometimes teach undergrads or at least master's students and so on, um, the point of an undergraduate degree or the point of school in general is really to teach people how to become very good learners. And I think part of that is really to just be able to get obsessed with a subject and really take time and explore it. So that's what I did. And I was also really interested in sort of what is today called sort of social justice work, although I don't think we used that terminology at that time. So I was really interested in sort of globalization. I was part of these big anti-globalization protest movements in the 1990s, led by students like myself. And I was able to sort of pursue that as a career, not because it was related to my degree, but because I had allowed myself to discover what it means to be passionate about something. And being passionate about global economic justice was certainly what I was all about, 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
And you wouldn't have accomplished that in Columbia or any other school? I'm wondering, like, is it a very popular major? Is it not that popular? I'm wondering
Yeah.
how was it that you came to your college options?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, in the beginning, looking back at the first year was a bit of everything. So I took sort of intro to social psychology was a popular class. You know how it is in these bigger universities, you sit in an auditorium with like 300 people doing a first year, whatever it is. So for me, the big ones were feminist theory was a big one in the first couple of years, social psychology, um, Greek philosophy, or maybe it was moral philosophy. I think it was moral philosophy, but we focused a lot on Kant and Plato, I believe, or Kant and Aristotle. Sorry. So you take a little bit of everything that was sort of vaguely of interest to you with a liberal arts bent, and then you sort of explore and you see what you're good at. Some things, like, I was told that I was really good at, so I need to continue it, but it turned out not. I didn't have much passion for that. So, for example, my first year logic class, which is another one of those things with 300 students. I think I got the top mark in the class, and I didn't sign up for this year 2 class that was the 101. I didn't sign up for the 201 or whatever it was. And the professor sort of called me to his office one day and said, "Look, you got the top marks in the class. I want you to do the 200 version, you know?" So I did, and it was really, really tough. And it wasn't really, my head really wasn't in it either. So you learn sometimes just by things that you have an aptitude for, maybe they're not what you have a passion for. And so you need to find the right balance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And so so all this was happening while you were in Montreal.
100%. Yeah. All this was happening while I was in Montreal. And I was also, for much of this time, I was doing a lot of volunteer work with various social justice organizations. And I was also working at a bookstore for most of this, I would say, for almost the entire, well, at least the last 3 years.
So so you were able to find work while you were over there. So
So most places, I guess I can't speak for most places, but in Canada, Australia, and South Africa, when you have a student visa, you are allowed to work part-time. So there's a certain number of hours that you can work without worrying too much, and you can use your student visa as sort of the credential to get your tax number or whatever it is you need. So that's what I did. I think, I'm not going to remember exactly, but I think if you work less than 20 hours a week, it's no issue. You can just do it on the same student visa. At least it was at that time. And it still is the case. I know that's still the policy in South Africa as well.
that's good to know. So anyone, who's if there's any international viewers, you can work on a student visa. So that's a good point. So now I want to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier was you were factoring in the cost of tuition, right? So you were thinking about the cost of Columbia and how much you were thinking about, well, how much student loans you would have to take out, how much your parents would have to give you. So you were factoring in all those things, and then and you obviously chose to go to Montreal. So, where so what were this? How do I ask my question? Did you end up taking out student loans in Montreal? How much did your parents give you? How did the financial part work out?
Yes. So, I guess most of your listeners are in the US, Gabrielle, but, for the rest of the world, like university or college tuition is not like it is in the US, right? So for many countries, like I know if you study in Europe, there's no real fee to speak of. There might be some now, but a lot of those are incidental. So you might pay for books and board and stuff like that. But the actual college fees, that's something that's included in their tax system. There's no system for like user fees for university education for a lot of countries. I'm thinking of countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, that kind of stuff. Um, Even many universities in Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, etc., you won't have those kind of high tuitions that you have in the US. Now, what's happened since when I was in Canada, I'm trying to remember the exact figure I paid, but it was in the order of 8,000 Canadian per year. And at that time, the Canadian dollar was a little bit weak. So put that in US terms, it may have been 6,000 US. So between the difference between 6,000 US and 25,000 US, or, it's a massive difference. So yeah, I ended up not having to take out student loans. I also qualified for some kind of scholarship program. I'm not going to remember all the details of it, but whatever tuition I had to pay, a lot of it ended up being covered, and my parents were able to help me out with the rest. So I ended up not going into any debt at all. And again, speaking from the South African experience, so there has been a push to privatize education in a lot of countries in the last 15, 20 years. But even despite all of that, so university tuition in South Africa is much more expensive than it has ever been. But it's still, when I put it in US dollars, I put the amount of money that I paid to register in my PhD program, it's like a couple thousand, maybe 3 or 4 thousand. And that was a one-off fee. So I only pay that once, and then, I have to pay a smaller amount. It's in the hundreds of dollars every year to sort of renew my registration. Um, these are rough estimates, don't quote me on this stuff, but almost every other country is going to be an order of magnitude cheaper than the US. So that may be something to consider.
I mean, was the difference made up for in other ways? Because you still have to get a visa, you still have to get a plane, over. Well, I don't know how you got to Canada, but you still have to get to Canada, you still have room, board, all that good, all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
were those costs made up in other things?
Yeah, so for me, because I wasn't planning to sort of stay with my parents, like the room and board stuff would have been there anyway if I had gone to New York. So there are costs. Like I'm not saying that it's zero, but it's just not. Going to a university in the U.S. is just so much more expensive than anything else. That even when you factor in everything else, you factor in the plane tickets. In those days, flying to Canada was a lot more expensive than it is today. Now flying to Canada is not much. I think it's roughly the same price as going from the East Coast to the West Coast. So it's not a huge expense in that sense. Um, but yeah, so there are costs, but it's not gonna. You're always going to end up. Um, it's going to be a net positive to avoid the U.S. tuition.
Everything okay? Okay. All right. So, how did Canada come to mind? Like, do you have family in Canada? Have you been there before? How did
Yeah.
it even enter your universe?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in those days, we had something, it was very, very common. I imagine it still is, that if you go to school on the East Coast, if you're sort of a middle class person, you would do a sort of tour of the Eastern Seaboard and visit some of the colleges. Usually when you're, I think it's the junior year that you have to sort of figure your life out. So maybe like the summer between the sophomore and the junior year, my dad took me on a trip. So we started in DC. We went north. We went through Philadelphia, so UPenn. We saw Columbia in New York. We saw a bunch of schools in Boston. We went up to Vermont for some reason. I think we checked out UVM. And then up to Canada, we went to the University of Toronto, as I mentioned, and we went to Montreal. Montreal just struck me as so I was how old must I have been 16 at that time. It was just a very different kind of place. The vibe was so different than the rest of the U.S. and Canada. And I want to say I fell in love with it, but it wasn't really love. It was just like fascination. It was like, oh, this is so different than what I'm used to. And so that made me think, well, I'm looking for schools to apply to. I didn't actually know much about McGill. I knew that at that time, it was the top ranked school, maybe number 2 in Canada. So it had a very good reputation. But aside from that, I didn't know much about it, but I didn't know that much about any of the schools I was applying to. Right. So for me, it was a bit of a gamble, but it paid off in spades, because I think the kind of cultures you get exposed to, the kind of world you get exposed to, even for me as a philosophy and religious studies student, I was studying from one of my teachers was at the time he was a Zen monk who was in the process of trying to not be a Zen monk anymore. Still a very famous guy. His name is Victor Hori, one of the top scholars of Japanese Buddhism. There's a guy called Giovanni di. Oh, I'm blanking on his last name, but he's an Italian guy, Hegel scholar, absolutely brilliant philosopher. He's written. I've looked him up recently. He's written. His name is Di Giovanni. He's written 5 or 6 books on 19th century German idealism, specifically on Hegel and Kant and Marx. So it's like these things that were not really. Also the perspective, right? So I was going to university, a few years after the Berlin Wall fell, and there were really no scholars of Marx in the U.S. And this professor told the story about when he first started teaching Marx in Canada. It was highly controversial, although from his point of view, this is just another of 5 or 6 philosophers that he teaches in his course on German idealism, right? There's nothing overwhelmingly important in his view, except that he's part of this intellectual tradition that needs to be regarded with some respect. Right. So anyway, so the fact that you get a different intellectual culture, you get different sort of political cultures, and you get access to the different culture in general. I mean, just the debates when I was in Quebec were about separatism, were about what it means to be French speaking as opposed to English speaking, as opposed to speaking other languages. There was a referendum on, so Quebec almost became its own country during my first year there. I learned to speak French by watching The Simpsons dubbed in French, dubbed in Quebecois, like dubbed in this particular dialect of French, which is really hard to understand if you've learned Parisian French. So, all this stuff, I mean, I wouldn't trade it for the world. That's sort of what formed me into the person that I am, and the person that I am is a very open-minded, but sort of very critical thinking kind of person. So since that time, I've lived in half a dozen countries or more. I speak 10 languages. I've been able to really, I think I've been able to open myself up and enjoy the world in a way that not everyone can, especially people who sort of spend all their lives in the US, which was an option for me. I could have spent my whole life here and done pretty well, I think. But I chose a different path, and I'm glad I did.
You speak 10 languages fluently?
I speak, so the languages I speak fluently are English, French, German, and then Urdu. So Urdu and Hindi. So those are, we count them two different languages. Then the languages that I studied, but I don't really have enough practice speaking. So Arabic is there. And then the languages that I sort of pick up, I say I speak what I call taxi and restaurant. So Indonesian, Thai, Spanish, Portuguese. If you drop me in any one of those countries, like in Brazil, it takes me like a couple days to sort of reset myself, but then I'm pretty good in Portuguese. So I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but I can get by.
Wow, wow. So it's because you went to Canada and because you had this international exposure, it's like it set your life on this course, right? Where you're learning all these different languages, you're going to all these different countries, you're actually not just visiting these countries but actually living there, right? And you're doing more than just living there. You're going to school, right? In these different countries. And so it's like since you went to Canada, your life just shifted.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's also to do, I think everyone like, or a lot of people, when you get to college for the first time, like it is a life-changing experience. So I don't want to overstate it, but I think my specific version of that life-changing experience set me on a particular course. And that particular course was to learn more about the world. The world is a small place, but we got, 7, 8 billion of us to learn from and maybe to teach now too, as I'm getting older. And so I think it's really important to be open to those experiences and to learn as much as we can, because language is a good example, right? So there's so many different. For example, I saw the other day a post. In Arabic has 10 different ways to say the word friend, each with different connotations. And when you understand that, you understand, okay, what's important about a specific society, what's important about a specific culture, that they need 10 different ways to have an idea that we in English only have one for. Well, it's interesting stuff to think about. And I think as long as you open your mind up to being receptive to these things and being willing to learn, you can get a lot out of life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now let's jump ahead. So now bachelor's is done. You come back to America, I assume, right? Um, what was the feeling coming back home?
Yeah, I mean, so remember, we have summer holidays, we have other things, and Montreal isn't that far away from Washington. So it's hard for me to answer that question without putting the whole thing in context. Like I had I had a very rushed move back home, so I had to submit, in order to graduate with the kind of degree I wanted, or I was graduating with. I had to submit a thesis, and because, like a lot of kids in their undergrad, I was procrastinating. I was only doing stuff at the last minute. So my last day in Canada, I went. So I printed off my thesis. I cleaned out my apartment, which was a huge mess. Thanks, Eric, my friend, for helping me clean out my apartment that day. I put all my stuff in a U-Haul. I drove to a political rally that I was going to. We were protesting. The U.S. had launched some bombs against Afghanistan, so we did a bit of a mobilization and so on at the U.S. Embassy. I get back in my U-Haul. I drop off my thesis to my advisor, and I drive straight to Philadelphia for another demonstration. This one is for political prisoners, including Mumia Abu Jamal in Philadelphia. And then I get home and I'm exhausted. And it takes me a little while to recover from that sort of whirlwind experience. And then what happens soon after that? So I'm talking with an auntie of mine. So auntie, in my culture, like everyone who's older than you call auntie and uncle. So there's a friend of my family, and she's asking me, what I'm doing. And I said, look, I just graduated with this degree, etc. And she says, well, why don't you come with me to India and you can be the sort of unpaid intern? That sounded like fun. So I did that. I went to India, and there I just for a short, I think 2-week project kind of thing. During those 2 weeks, I met the woman who would later become my wife. So then we have a love story there too. She's the one who she has a scholarship to go to Australia. So within a few months, she goes to Australia in, I want to say, June or July of 1999. By December, I get my admission to the same university, and we go over there together to do our masters. So it wasn't much time in the U.S. before I go on to the next study abroad journey.
So you were barely home. You were
I
like
wasn't
a
home for
rushed.
much.
You were home for a little bit, and then your auntie says, "Hey, come with me to India," and you're like,
Yeah.
"Okay."
So between that, so that was so the India trip was like May of '99, and then from June to December, I was working for someone working as a research assistant in the University of Louisville, Kentucky. So all these things, and that's again someone who I met through that same India trip. So she said, you seem to be a very good researcher. Why don't you come and work for me at the University of Louisville? And I could have stayed there and done more there as well, but probably as a teacher at that point, is I think what she was grooming me for. But it was a good opportunity to go and just get my master's done as well.
All right, and then you already jumped ahead, but you went to Australia because you followed your wife there.
At the
Um,
time, girlfriend, but yeah,
at the time,
100%.
girlfriend, you followed her there to Australia,
Yeah,
and you decided, I'm just gonna do my master's here while I'm at it. So it was kind of it was by love, was it, that you ended up in Australia?
100%, 100%. The joke is, I have a degree in women's studies from Australia, but the joke is I went to study one particular woman. Um, yeah, yeah. But it was a great experience in Australia. Very different kind of experience because um, what McGill is located in downtown Montreal, and it is a city of, I don't know how many million people, but it is a big city, one of the biggest cities in Canada. It is a cosmopolitan city. I used to play in punk rock bands. I used to be involved in jazz music a little bit. It was just a very urban kind of a scene. But where I was in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, first of all, is a smaller city than Montreal. But this particular campus is like, it's very remote. I mean, you could be anywhere in the world, and it's just sort of isolated from everywhere else. So the kind of experience that you would get in like, I don't know what the U.S. equivalent is, like going to something like the University of Vermont or a university in upstate New York, something like that, where it's completely isolated from the world. That's what it was in Australia. So it was just a different kind of campus, different kind of vibe. Um, Different kind of work as well, because I wasn't really used to, I don't know. There's something about the work ethic in different countries that tends to change. And so, I think I was okay in McGill, but in Melbourne, I was kind of a star student. I was like, people were passing around my essays to like, this is the model essay and we're going to copy it. And I was like, that's a bit weird for me to be to be the model student. That's not how certainly not how I self-identified at the time. But I did very well in that program, and it was a lot of fun. I was only partly interested in the academics, as we've discussed. Like, most of it was about building out what turned out to be the most important relationship of my life. So, it was a good experience, but the academics were only part of it. For the last half of my degree there, I was also editing the sort of college magazine. So that was my job there. It was a lot of good fun, but again, a lot of pressure, a lot of deadlines, a lot of work.
So how was Australia different from Canada?
At the time, it was just a very different place. So I know more about these places because in my career since then, I've been back to Australia several times. But at the time, I would say Australia was a cross between sort of U.S. culture and British culture, and a little bit more towards the British side of things. So it was a little bit weird for me to get used to like the spellings and stuff. Now it's gone more to the American side of things, which is different. It's all right. The thing about Australia also is that like I'm saying, every place has its own culture. Once you sort of understand that the things that are important in Australia tend to be like sports and beer, and they have this concept of mateship, so sort of friendship, but a certain take on friendship. Once you understand that these are the things that the culture values very highly, then you're going to do fine. But for us, so my wife is originally from India, and I'm from the US. Like, and we're both kind of workaholics, or at least we have those tendencies. Like, we want to be always busy. We want to be always challenging ourselves. The more laid back attitude in Australia was a little bit of culture shock, but in a good way. On the flip side, I mean, we were able to finish 2-year degree programs in about, I mean, in my case, I think it was about 9 months. In her case, it was about a year. So we were able to take a sort of accelerated track because we wanted to work. We wanted to work really hard, and we wanted to start our married life. We wanted to work hard, get our degrees, and then, start earning some money so we could buy a house and settle down and have a family and all that kind of stuff.
So it was a a lot of different factors. So in that, so you were already used to traveling abroad, so it wasn't that intense for you this time around. And I would imagine like Canada and Australia are pretty similar culturally. Um,
Yeah, I mean, in the language, I mean, Canada, Australia, the U.S., these are all settler colonial states with a huge sort of British influence. So there's not, yeah, culturally there are points of similarity, but at that point, remember, we're talking about before the internet was what it is today, long before the internet was what it is today. So if you wanted to understand a place, immersion, like sort of living in it, was definitely the best way to do it. There's no way I could have prepared for life in Australia before I got there. And yeah, once we got there, it was great. Shooting. My partner has had a great friend there who we spent time with her family. We spent time in the mountains. It was really, just a really unique experience. Um, yeah, and I'm not sure. So since then, I tend to gravitate, as I say, towards the big cities, and I've lived in bigger cities most of my life. So I'm not sure I'd want to do it again. But at the time, it was absolutely an incredible experience of just being sort of on our own someplace, new young couple trying to figure out the world, trying to figure out each other too, and in the meanwhile trying to help each other with our thesis as well. This is the day when if you didn't back up your papers on like floppy disks, your computer would sometimes die and you'd have to start the whole damn thing from scratch. And I remember, I think Shireen lost, like, I can't remember, 20 or 30 pages of her thesis, so of her master's thesis at one point, and so we had to like retype it. Like, these kind of dramas, I suppose I don't know what the equivalent of it is today, but those kind of things you really learn from, and it also builds a relationship to be going through the trenches of these kind of things together.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's what you were doing, right? So it's like, yeah, you were going to school, but you were also, trying to buy a house. You're building a new life. So it's like, I guess you didn't really have a lot of. I mean, when you did your bachelor's, it was just, I'm here for school and that's it. And now you're doing your master's. It's like, I'm here for school. I'm here for marriage. I'm here to build my life. So it's like, I'm assuming that's one of the reasons why you did the accelerated program in Australia, was let's get the school thing over with and focus on my new life as a husband, as a homeowner.
Yeah, that's all part of it. I mean, another big part of it is that I was still sort of had a foot in the movements in the U.S. and sort of the political organizing in the U.S. So, this was probably stuff before your time, Gabrielle, but there were these massive protests in Seattle that I was involved in, similar protests in Washington, D.C., and so on. So, I was on these, I was trying to be involved in this organizing in the early days of email, was how we were doing it. There certainly wasn't Zoom or anything like that. At the same time, and I was anxious to sort of get back to either the U.S. or Canada, where I could be part of those movements again. There's stuff in Australia too. Like, I don't want to say there's nothing. Like, we did a demonstration. I think it was APEC Summit of the year 2000, but it wasn't the kind of vibrant political community that we had in places like New York, Washington D.C., Montreal, Seattle, Vancouver. Like, the movement was very far ahead of where it was in Australia, and I didn't want to be. I didn't want to. It felt like a step down. Like, going to Australia felt like, okay, these guys need another 10 years to get their act together, and I don't have that kind of patience. So I want to go to where things are strong. Does that make sense?
So there was a lot of political movements also happening, and that also influenced your stay in Australia, or
For sure,
okay,
for sure. No, it was a. I mean, we tried to get involved there, and we did get involved there, but it was just an impetus to sort of get out and get back to places where we knew the community and the movements a little bit more intimately.
I mean, did you ever go back to DC? I mean, your parents had to meet your wife, right? So, did you ever go back to DC?
We did. So the masters we finished in the year 2000, and we went back to DC in 2001. I got a job doing exactly what I wanted to do, so being part of this anti-globalization movement. And I think I started that job February or March of 2001. In September 2001, as you know, the whole landscape changes. We have the 9/11 attacks, and suddenly it becomes a very, very different political landscape. And then that was an impetus to sort of, I don't know if that was the only impetus, but that was one impetus to sort of say, when opportunities came up abroad, I sort of took that. So I had the opportunity to become a CEO of a sort of NGO in the Philippines at the ripe old age of, how old would I have been? 27. So for me, that was a big deal. To become a CEO at age 27 was kind of a big deal, and I was happy to do that. Going to the Philippines had its own difficulties, its own issues. But again, if I hadn't had so much time abroad, I probably wouldn't have been as open to the idea.
Right, because you're already used to it. You know, you speak all these other languages. You're used to being around different cultures and different types of people and languages, and you're already used to being around different. So it's like you're a chameleon. Would you consider yourself a chameleon?
A little bit. I mean, I think that can be a bit overstated in the sense that people use the term global citizen and all this kind of stuff. Like, you have to be aware of the privilege that you're bringing to, especially doing the kind of work that I'm doing, or that I was doing at the time. You have to be aware of the kind of privilege that you're bringing to any particular situation. So you can't suddenly say, "Oh, I'm a Brazilian. I come from Rio because I've been living here for 2 weeks." No, that's not how it works. But you can, the mistake that I see a lot of people from the U.S. make is they're sort of, if they say they grew up in New York and they're sort of a loud in your face New Yorker. Some of my best friends are loud in your face New Yorkers. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem is, if you have that personality, like, everywhere you go, you're just alienating people because they're not used to loud in your face New Yorkers. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
learn how to tone it down. You have to learn how to listen, rather than just speak and demand to be heard, right? And you have to understand that language is an issue, culture is an issue, and not everything that's, even if you speak the language, you're not going to understand everything that is being communicated to you. There are levels of communication that are beyond language that you need to be really quiet and sit in your space and really begin to understand. So as long as if you ask me what the secret to being the kind of chameleon that you describe is, it's about being a good listener. It's about being patient. So if you can do those things, and it's about being open, and not, things are not always going to go your way, and you have to be okay with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So once you sort of accept that, and you're willing to take a step back, and you don't want immediate gratification from every conversation or even every meal or whatever, every experience that you're having, then you're going to do a lot better, because you're entering a space where you can put your own personality aside. Not that you abandon your personality; you can still be the loud in your face New Yorker, but just take a step back and just be quiet and just listen to what's going on around you, because I promise you, the people who are, there's levels that you don't understand, but if you make an effort to understand them, you're going to be a better person in the end too.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, I want to make sure we get to your PhD. All right, so how on earth did you end up in South Africa for your PhD?
Right. So I had a career in which we sort of briefly touched on places of it, but I work for a number of large nonprofit organizations, some of which you will have heard of, some of which you haven't, probably haven't. So Amnesty International was there for a little while. Then I worked for ActionAid International. Now, ActionAid International moved its headquarters from London to Johannesburg back in 2004, I want to say, maybe 2009. I may not have the year exactly right. But I originally, when I started working for them, I was in charge of sort of Asia policy work. So I was based in Asia. And then at a certain point, I was in charge of global work. So I had to move to Johannesburg. So that's how we ended up there. And then, these big organizations are always going through layoffs. 1 year, the layoff sort of affected the whole policy department, unfortunately. So we had the choice: do we move somewhere else, or do we just stick around? At that point, my daughter was of an age where I was really reluctant to sort of move her so quickly. We had just moved to Joburg, and I didn't want to just move her again. So I started a PhD originally just as a way to sort of stay in Joburg, but also because I had some academic interests that I felt like 20 years in the NGO sector, there's stuff I wanted to write, stuff I wanted to say, theories I wanted to engage with, that I hadn't had the chance to do fully. And I had a supportive friend who was a professor, a very well-known professor in South Africa, who sort of encouraged me to think through what it means to write a PhD thesis. And now I'm at the tail end of that process. It's been a lot of work. So the process I'm describing sort of started in 2017, 2018. We're now 5 years out from that, and like I told you, I'm just about to submit a draft. So it's a hell of a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been really fascinating to have this time to both engage with these theories, but also to hear from my peers, hear from other students, hear from master's students about what people are thinking about with regard to these things these days. And in general, what I'm writing about is sort of the history. It's a history of the world kind of paper, but it's specifically focusing on colonialism and also indigenous peoples in Southern Africa. So it's really fascinating. It's a fascinating time to be in this space. There's a lot of discoveries being made. And I think working at the PhD level, you really, it's like you have your finger on the pulse of all those discoveries that are happening. A lot of times it's hard to, if you just sort of get your information from the internet, or if you're doing your own studies independently, there's so much material out there. You don't really know what's the really cutting edge stuff, and what's like, okay, this is okay, but it's not that interesting. But when you're part of an academic community, that's a whole different story. You really do. There really are good filters for, like, oh my goodness, this is amazing stuff, I need to focus on that, versus I'm not really sure this fits in the current picture we're trying to paint.
So it's like you're learning more about the world everywhere you go. It sounds like.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is these days, doing a PhD, you're part of a global community of academics, who are, in my case, I'm part of a global community of academics who are focusing on post-colonial theory, right? And it's really fascinating to be part of that community. Yes, many of them are in South Africa, but some of them are in the US, some of them are in Canada, some of them are Australia, some of them are, in India or in other countries, right? So it's been really fascinating to see these conversations unfold, and hopefully, I can contribute to those conversations too, in some ways, by publishing a few academic articles, and ultimately by publishing my dissertation.
Uh, well, you're already used to writing all these theses, so
Yeah.
it's nothing new. So now, in thinking about it, because you're doing, and just hearing you talk this whole time, it's like there's a lot of moving that you're doing. So, um, how are you funding all of these trips?
Yeah. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, it was a bit of relying on, or asking my parents for a loan or for a gift, basically, to sort of get it going. But then, for the last 20 years, I've had a career, and it hasn't been the best paying career in the whole world. So I went to a high school where I was going to school with, like, Rockefellers, and the daughters of vice presidents, and so on. So it's a very elite school. And I look at some of my peers who made money in Wall Street and so on, or whatever it may be. Like, I can't compete with that, but I don't really need to compete with that. I had a salaried job for 20 years that allowed me to put some savings away. And I'm using those savings in part to finance these moves, and in part to finance, in part to also to invest in my new business, which is health coaching, right? So in part to sort of say, I'm going to, I put 20 years into a career. I've had a salaried job for 20 years. And I no longer think I can make the best contribution by continuing to do sort of work for other people. I want to work for myself. And I also want to finish my PhD at the same time. That's where I am right now in this journey.
So in the beginning, it's like you were relying on your parents, but as you kind of came into your own, and you got into your career, you were funding yourself, right? You were putting money away, you used your savings, and you used that to do all this moving and all these trips, and especially with going to school in other countries where the tuition is actually cheaper, you were able to afford to go to all these schools.
100%. I mean, I think when you're talking about postgraduate level and especially PhD level, I think the economics of it changes in a place like the US because I don't think many people pay. They certainly don't pay the kind of tuition you pay for a bachelor's for a PhD. Like it comes under grants and other things. So I think the funding thing, like the difference between the U.S. and abroad, is less the higher up you go. But yeah, 100% what you said is correct. I've used the savings I've made from having a salary for 20 years. I use that to fund not so much the moves. The moves have been paid for by the companies I work for, pretty much. But yeah, things like the university tuition and so on, or my daughter's tuition, just getting supporting a family. I've used those savings to do all that right now, and invest in a new business.
So you must be a good saver.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. To be honest, I'm probably not a great saver, but I think it's just a matter of being a little bit disciplined when you are making that, because if let's say, for example, you get out of college and you have a job making whatever it is, 70,000 a year, let's say, for the sake of argument, right? Chances are very high you've never seen that much money in your life. Like even at least if I had got a job making 70,000 my first year out of college, I would never have seen that kind of money in my life. And I think it's about the discipline to say, okay, that doesn't mean I'm going to upgrade my car and my house and my whatever it is. What it means is there's a percentage of this that I'm just going to put away right away. In fact, I'm not going to see it. I'm going to give the bank orders or give the whatever, that when my paycheck comes in, X percent of it goes into an account. And if you do that every paycheck, every payday, week after week, month after month, year after year, it builds up eventually to the point where you do have savings, and if they're being invested wisely, you have savings that are growing, and that's a great place to be. And it's not that difficult these days. Not saying it's easy, and university degrees are no longer the kind of guarantees of sort of good jobs that they once were. But I think most of us, if you have a plan, it's not hard to sort of have a financial plan as well.
Of course, of course. So just to tie it all in a bow. So now all of your education, all of your secondary education, it's was all in other countries. So now is it safe to so what would you tell someone who is trying to save money? Because I mean that's essentially what you were trying to do is looking for the cheaper option, right? So you want to avoid student loans. So is it safe to say if you want to save money, go to another country?
I think if you're in the U.S., I think that's still probably true. You'd have to do your own research and look at it, the specific places you want to go. There are these private universities that have opened up all over the world that can be very expensive. So it's going to vary from place to place. Um, but in general, studying abroad is a great option for not just for the price tag. The price tag is a big piece of it, to be honest. But not just the price tag; it's just the experience as well. Like I had an experience when I was working at Amnesty International that I got to visit, the Dublin, Ireland branch of Amnesty International, and looking at how that city, so Dublin in Ireland, how it's built around a university, which is Trinity College. It's a really fascinating sort of place, fascinating culture, and it made me think, hey, maybe this is, if I had it to do again, maybe I would have applied here because it's a very different kind of a field, right? In retrospect, of course, I wouldn't change anything. I love what I did, but there's many options for people who are interested in exploring. And the world's a big, beautiful place, and so get out there and explore it.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, so we are starting to wind down a bit. So I like to ask my guests to share any words of wisdom with our audience. So, do you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, the words wisdom on this subject are really not to be too attached to your own identity. Like I think I see this in folks in the U.S., not just the U.S., but especially the U.S., where we're so attached to who we are as like Americans or whatever, X kind of American or X kind of U.S. citizen or however you want to put it, that we forget that, fundamentally, what are we? We are animals, we are mammals, we are humans. And there's so much we share in common with other people, but there's so much that we have to learn from other people too. So I think exploring with an open mind, being willing to learn new languages, learn, new skills. I really think that's what's, looking ahead at what I sort of need from my students going forward. It's really that intellectual curiosity combined with pretty sharp critical thinking skills, right? So we need both of those. You need to be intellectually curious about what's going on in the world, but you also need to think very critically about and not accept everything that everyone is telling you. So I mentioned earlier, even if you can speak the language, there are things going on that you probably can't understand, which is true. But someone's point of view is not the gospel truth, right? So, for example, I'll tell you a quick story. We were on a holiday. We were on a ship a couple of years ago, and my wife knew that I speak Portuguese, and there was a Brazilian couple there. So I was speaking with them. I was helping my wife to communicate with them, translating and so on. And these are people who had a very specific point of view. They were from a region in Brazil that was kind of conservative. So my wife at a certain point asked me, so they were talking about the imprisonment of the person who's now the president, Lula. I don't want to get into Brazilian politics, but this is just a side story. So my wife says, but I thought Lula was good and most Brazilians support him. And I had to explain, like, you have to understand the person you're talking to is coming from a particular region which has historically been anti this guy, anti the Workers' Party, which is his political party. And therefore, you shouldn't be surprised by what they're telling you. But what they're telling you is not the gospel truth. It's just one opinion. And you have to get a lot more opinions before you understand what the quote unquote Brazilian view on this, because just like there's no US view on any one political figure here, there's no one Brazilian view on any political figure there. You have to get a diversity of views before you can come to your own judgment about what you believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Sameer, thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom, and thank you for coming on my show. This was definitely an enlightening conversation. So now we're going to jump to your promo. Want to make sure people can find you, but I guess as part of your promo, you sent over a video, so I'm going to play that video right now.
You can only play the first couple minutes. I think you can cut it at minute 2 if you like.
Okay, well, let's see. Well, actually, no. Let's actually, before we do that, I'm gonna do your stuff first, and then we'll do the video so people have a context of the video. All right, so let me just jump into your information. All right, so you guys, you can find Sameer Dossani. He is all over the web. He You can learn more about his business, which I'll have him tell you about in a minute. But his website is just his name, sameerdossani.net. You could also follow him on YouTube. It is Meat Heals. That's the account name. He's also on Twitter and TikTok with, it is just his name, Sameer Dossani. He's also on Instagram. It is Sam3R. That's the account name. And he's also on LinkedIn, which is just his name, and Facebook. It is Sameer Dossani Health Coaching. So I encourage you guys to follow him on all of those accounts. I also encourage you to go to his website, sameerdossani.net. All of this information, of course, is scrolling below at the bottom of the screen for my video people. But if you are listening to this on a podcast, I did not forget about you. This information is in the description with the direct links to these accounts. So I encourage you, my audience, to go to all of these accounts and follow him everywhere and just stay in touch with him. So, Sameer, I'm going to have you talk about your business. So please tell us about your business.
Sure.
Tell yourself to us.
Sure. Well, I mentioned in 2017, I had the opportunity to begin a PhD. And what I did when I began a PhD, it was the same year that I myself got a certain diagnosis. So as we get older, a lot of your viewers may not be there yet, but maybe their parents could identify with this. As we get older, the body tends to break down in certain predictable ways, right? And my best friend had a cancer diagnosis. I was getting diagnosed with diabetes, pre-diabetes, that kind of thing. My wife was going through kidney stone issues and thyroid issues and many things. My daughter was also suffering a lot from asthma and so on. So I got admission to the science and technology department at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. But I didn't go to that library. I went to the medical library, which was next door, the day I got admission, And I went to the medical library. I spent 8 hours, maybe longer, just going through all the medical texts I could find on health, nutrition, studies of randomized control studies, and so on. And I really discovered that I'd been lied to about health and nutrition for all these years. And that day I sort of stopped being a vegetarian of any kind. I started adding more meat to my diet. I reversed all of my health problems within a matter of weeks. It made me so angry that I decided to, get my own health and nutrition certification. So we didn't talk about that, but that was an online program based in the UK that I got a health and nutrition certification from in 2021. And I've been a health coach ever since that. I help people to reverse their chronic disease, had all kinds of success stories. People with pulmonary embolisms in both lungs as a result of COVID thought they would never be able to sort of walk around freely again or exercise. Within a few months of working with me, they're starting a new career, starting a new life, off all their medications and so on. So it's been really remarkable to be able to help people reverse their chronic disease. And I'm hoping to really scale it up. I'm about to launch a new course on sort of mineral and vitamin deficiencies that people have. So you can check and how to reverse them with diet. So you can check out sameerdossani.net and you'll get all the information on that course coming up.
Beautiful. And with that said, now we're going to get into your video. So now we did the setup to your video. So
it's a funny video, if I can just say so. So like I said, most of us think that fruits and vegetables are good for us. There's a guy called Uncle Roger who's been sort of blowing up on the internet. Hilarious guy, Malaysian, based in the UK. He has a line, vegetables are sad, and this video is about how I agree with him.
All right, so I will play that now.
No need vegetable. Vegetable tastes like sad.
Yes, indeed, Uncle Roger is right. Vegetables taste like sad. Why is that? Let's get into it. Before we do, my name's Sameer and I'm a health coach who works with people who want to thrive while incorporating more animal foods into their diet. If you'd like to book a strategy session with me, the link is below. So the last time I raised this question, it was largely about ancient history, meaning my work as an anthropologist interested in paleoanthropology and so on. So if we look at the fossil record, we can discover that humans evolved to be hyper-carnivores. And the first time we incorporated plant foods on any kind of scale, so I mentioned a paper that talked about people eating acorns in North Africa, and it was pretty miserable, right? We have toothless skulls in the fossil record to show exactly how miserable it was, right? Today, let's get a little bit deeper into another angle. So what is a vegetable? And why would this vegetable elicit so much sadness? So I think it's super important to emphasize in the beginning that most of the things we call vegetables simply did not exist in their current form 1,000 years ago, or in some cases much more recently, right? Tomatoes were cultivated by the Aztecs, maybe in the 13th century CE, so less than 1,000 years ago. Carrots, broccoli, cabbage, these were all cultivated in Central Asia, probably around 600 CE, so that's roughly 1,500 years ago. If that sounds like a long time ago, remember that our genes are at least 250,000 years old, right? And, that kind of a time scale in general, unless there's a huge pressure, is not going to be enough to turn us from carnivores into vegetarians, right? We don't know everything about what early humans were eating, but as I say, we know that they ate a lot of meat, and we know they weren't eating broccoli because broccoli didn't exist, right? Okay, so the next question is, so we've sort of defined what a vegetable is, and I should say fruits, by the way, are also in this category. Fruits are also relatively modern constructs, as we'll get into in a minute. So the next question is, do you think the purpose of a plant is just to feed you? Do you think that a carrot is just there to be delicious for you, or spinach is there to eat with your paneer or something, right? No, obviously that's not the case. Plants are life forms, and like any species on Earth, they want to live long enough to reproduce. And how do they do that in a dangerous world? Well, they wage chemical warfare. Plants produce chemicals to avoid predation, mostly predation by insects, right? There are thousands of such chemicals, and very few of them have been studied. Some people will talk about you need to eat organic vegetables. because these have fewer pesticides. But as this paper explains very clearly, the vast majority of pesticides, so that's 99.99%, the vast majority of pesticides you're exposed to are naturally occurring in the plant. Now, those pesticides, those toxins were designed to kill insects. And just to be clear, in the dosage you're going to get them, even if you eat, unless you're eating hemlock or something that's actually poisonous, you're not going to die from eating broccoli, right? I'm not saying that, and that would be a ridiculous thing to say. But what happens when you're consuming just a little bit of poison every day? The short answer is we don't know. So some people would argue it's a good thing that there's a hormetic effect of eating these poisons. Hormetic, the easiest way to think about it is, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So if I have a little bit of poison, then that builds up my strength overall. There's some evidence to suggest that that might be the case, but the evidence is kind of tenuous. I can get into that in another video if you like. If you consistently overconsume certain plant foods, for example, if you're eating those cruciferous vegetables every day, we do tend to see bad effects. Overconsumption of cruciferous, as I mentioned, can mess up the thyroid. Cruciferous vegetables are your broccoli, your cabbages, and so on, everything from that mustard family. And the goitrogens in that class of food, that's one class of anti-nutrient or plant toxin. The other classes are oxalates. So Sally Norton has a great book out about oxalates right now, and also lectins. So there's a Dr. Stephen Gundry. You can find him on YouTube. You can read his books. His books have good information about lectins. The most famous lectin is gluten. By now, I think we've all heard about gluten. Almost everyone knows someone who has a gluten sensitivity or a gluten allergy or even has celiac disease, in which case ingesting gluten can be life-threatening. Does that mean you can't eat plant foods? Not necessarily. First of all, there's some plant foods that the plant wants you to eat, namely the fruits, right? So fruits are there to kind of tempt animals to take them, and the hope is that they will go and drop the seeds somewhere and give life to a new generation of plant, right? The problem is that most of the fruits we have today are also modern innovations, and they contain far more sugar than they would naturally, right? Sugar is a driver of all chronic diseases, including heart disease, cancer, and dementia. Not all fruits are equal in the sense that they don't all have the same sugar levels. I'll put a link below to download a list of fruits by their sugar content. And I should just say that, if you're healthy, then does it make sense to try avoiding whole fruits? Probably not, even the higher in sugar ones. But because so few of us are healthy, I do advise my clients to avoid those fruits that are higher in sugar. You can also do things to remove, so you can process the food in a way that you remove some or most, or in some cases all of the toxins. Actually, it's really hard to get rid of all the toxins, but you can get rid of most of them. Cooking in general, pressure cooking in particular, even something like salting food can remove some of the toxins. Unfortunately, when you do that, so you cook food, you process it, you pressure cook it, whatever good stuff, whatever nutrients was there in the vegetables, you're removing that as well. So here's a paper that looks at the data on how cooking and reheating food depletes vitamin C in vegetables in a hospital setting, right? And the interesting thing is they're finding people actually getting scurvy in a hospital setting because of lack of vitamin C, which is, very rare and bizarre thing to see. So if you don't cook your vegetables, so it's kind of a catch-22, right? If you don't cook your vegetables, you're going to get a dose of poison, right? Potentially harmful plant toxins. Yes, it's a small dose, but it's still poison, right? And if you cook them, you'll get far less of the poisons, but you'll get no nourishment from it. So, to me, that sounds like an extremely sad situation.
If vegetable tastes like sad, munch too tastes like terror.
With that, I'm Sameer. I'm a health coach, a PhD student. I'll see you next time.
Wow. That was a wealth of information that you shared there. So that's a taste of what you offer. So to my audience watching or listening, if you're interested in any of that, if you want to explore more, hit up Sameer. Just going to put up his information one more time. Hit him up, you guys. The information is on your screen. If you are listening to this on a podcast, the information is in the description, but I will just share his website. It is, one more time, SameerDossani.net. It is just his name, .net. You can't miss it. Did you want to share your podcast at all?
Sure, it's called Recovery and Transformation. If you're on, you can get it wherever you listen to podcasts. It might be a good idea to put my name in there too. So if you search Recovery and Transformation and Sameer Dossani, you'll definitely get it. There's some, and all of the episodes, almost all the episodes, are on YouTube as well. And some of those YouTube episodes have sort of graphics and stuff too, making it easier to follow. So you can either get them on YouTube or you can find it wherever you, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. I've had some good discussions there with, one of the themes that came up was about nutrition in India and how, this idea of India as a vegetarian country is A, not accurate, and B, a lot newer than people think, and has to do, and is tied in with British colonial history as well, for example.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely wonderful. All right. So the podcast again. So Sameer, you know what? Let's create a banner. I just want to have the visuals. So podcast
Recovery and Transformation.
Recovering transformation. That's it.
Yep. This is. I'll put a link to the speaker and the, if you like. Sorry, this is where that is, and Apple Podcasts is here.
Beautiful, beautiful. Oh, you're on speaker. Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for that. I'll make sure to add that to that description.
Great.
All right. So it's up on the screen, you guys. If you need a visual aid, the podcast is called Recovering Transformation. So it's, of course, you could find all that on the all those accounts that we gave earlier, but you could search for it directly, Recovering Transformation, and then just type in his name, and then okay, and you gotta run, and the information is there. So I encourage you to subscribe to his podcast while you're at it. All right, Sameer, I know you gotta go. I know we're over time. Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Awesome. Of course. All right, I'll let you go. All right, you guys. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Hot Topics. So let me get my information up on the screen. All right, so you guys, let me take this time to remind you who is covering Hot Topics. So where is Hot Topics coming from? All right, so Hot Topics is a production of my tutoring company, A Step Ahead Tutoring Services. So if you are looking for any kind of tutoring, any kind of academic help, whether it's one-on-one tutoring, test prep, college counseling, editing and proofreading, if you have a child who's struggling with getting the homework done, or struggling with any kind of learning disability, or just falling behind in school, or just promotion and doubt, or all, just one complaint after another, hit us up. We can help you. Our website is www.astepaheadtutoringservices.com. You can also call or text us at 347-762-2838. It is a lot of information, so I won't run through all of it, but the information is on the screen right now. If you are a video person, if you are an auditory person and you're listening to this on a podcast, the information is in the description. I will encourage you guys to find us on social media and follow us on our multiple social media accounts. So just type in A Step Ahead Tutoring Services and we will pop up. Just look for the pencil with the gray and black tip, and that is us. So I encourage you guys to follow us on social media and stay in touch with us and learn more about our services. But if you are looking for any kind of tutoring service, whether that is in person, if you happen to be in the New York City area, or online, we do extend throughout the United States. We are opening up to international clients as well. So if you happen to be listening or watching this in another country, hit us up. Let's see what we can do for you. But yes, so we have virtual services, we have in-person services for our New York City community. But if you are looking for any kind of tutoring service, please reach out to us. I will give the website once again. It is www.astepaheadtutoringservices.com. So reach out to us if you're looking for any kind of tutoring service. I also want to take this moment to remind you, please drop a comment in the comment section below. So wherever you are watching this video, leave a comment. Leave a comment in the comment section or in the comment thread. Let us know your thoughts about this episode. What did you learn? What didn't you learn? Any questions? Or if you were annoyed and just whatever it is, leave your comments in the comment section below of the video. If you're listening on a podcast, drop a rating. Drop a rating. You could also leave your comments in some podcast platforms. So whether Spotify, Good Pods, give us a comment, give us a rating, whatever it is, however you are taking in the sound of my voice, however you are receiving my spirit, I guess. Give us your feedback. We definitely will appreciate that, and it helps our algorithm. So it helps people find us online as well. So take a moment, you guys, 1 to 2 minutes, drop a comment, drop a note in the comment section, give us a rating as well. So take a moment and do that for us. Thank you. All right, you guys, that is it for today. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Hot Topics. I look forward to you joining me next time. Thank you again, and I am signing off. Bye.